I made the decision to allow my parents to live in the house. But when Mark, who can't even cook, had the audacity to suggest I leave, I couldn't believe it. He approached me with a smile, as if he had achieved something significant, and said something so outrageous that it left me speechless. I could never allow my parents to live in my house, only for Mark to try moving in with my in-laws without my permission and attempt to evict me, the rightful owner. Mark's controlling nature had bothered me for a while, but now it felt sickening. I couldn't continue this way with him. His entitled attitude and the way he behaved as if he owned the house, despite not contributing financially, had worn me down. I am Sarah, a woman in my 40s, and I work hard to support our family. Mark, my husband, stays at home and takes care of household chores. While I appreciate his contributions, his domineering personality had become unbearable. His demands, like asking me to fetch ice cream late at night, grated on my nerves. When I refused, he threatened me, reminding me of his supposed authority as the husband. His constant need to assert his dominance and demand respect solely based on his gender infuriated me. Dealing with his behavior on top of my demanding job felt unbearable. I finally told him, "I'm really tired." I had reached my breaking point and couldn't continue living like this. I decided to retreat to my room for some rest, seeking solace from the mounting tension with Mark. However, he wasn't pleased with my attitude and confronted me, demanding an explanation for my behavior towards him. Threats loomed in his words, his anger palpable as he asserted his authority over me. Feeling utterly drained, I mustered a forced smile and apologized, hoping he would understand my exhaustion. But Mark's disappointment in me only grew, leaving me no energy to argue. I apologized once more and withdrew to my room, my spirit crushed by his overbearing behavior. Day by day, I endured Mark's tyranny, worn down by his constant demands. My breaking point came when I fell severely ill, diagnosed with a stress-induced fever. Unable to move, I had to take a day off work, lying in bed, too weak to care for myself. When I told Mark about my condition, he dismissed it, accusing me of making excuses and refusing to help. Alone in my room, feverish and weak, I endured a night of unbearable pain. In my delirium, I wished for an end to my suffering. I longed for a simple gesture of care from Mark, a cold compress, or even just a comforting word. But my desires remained unmet, leaving me drowning in a sea of loneliness and self-doubt. Questions plagued my mind. Why was I the only one subjected to this torment? What had I done to deserve such treatment? The agony of my situation, coupled with Mark's callousness, weighed heavily on my soul, pushing me to the brink of despair. I couldn't help but wonder why things couldn't just work out with Mark. The pain from my ongoing ordeal brought me to tears, and when my fever finally subsided after 3 days of rest, I had to return to work. My colleagues and bosses showed genuine concern, asking if I was truly all right. Their kindness contrasted sharply with Mark's attitude, and their compassion moved me to tears. I felt I was reaching my emotional breaking point. A voice inside me screamed that I couldn't endure Mark any longer. I knew deep down that pushing myself so hard wasn't sustainable, that someday I would reach my limit. Yet, in my overwhelmed state, I couldn't gather the strength to confront the situation or contemplate preparing for a life without Mark. My affection for him had long faded, but the complexities of our shared life left me feeling trapped. Each day, I worked tirelessly, returning home only to be tossed around by Mark's whims. This cycle persisted, draining me both physically and emotionally. Then, one day, while I was trying to find solace in my room, Mark summoned me. It had been ages since we had a serious conversation, and his unusual excitement piqued my curiosity. As I settled down for the discussion, Mark, with a fervor I hadn't seen before, dropped a bombshell. He intended to let his parents live in our house. His callous remark about my inability to cook stung, but what struck me even harder was his plan to force me out. I couldn't fathom the selfishness behind his words. Mark, without considering my feelings, proceeded to outline his agenda. He wanted to change the house's ownership to include his parents, divorce me, and start a new family. He declared that these decisions were final and that my objections wouldn't change a thing. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, unable to comprehend the decisions he'd made without any regard for my emotions. When I broached the idea of living together, my parents were elated. They must have missed me dearly. It was my responsibility to be there for them as the man of the house. However, Mark, consumed by his own desires, arrogantly embraced the term man of the house, utterly oblivious to my feelings. I knew I couldn't continue this way with him. It was simply impossible. Mark chuckled dismissively, claiming that my love for him blinded me. He apologized insincerely, asserting that he only wanted to take care of his family. But I had no affection left for him. All that remained was my astonishment at his selfishness and my regret for not ending things sooner. I despised my past weakness for allowing him to take advantage of me. Why hadn't I cut ties with him earlier? If I had, he wouldn't have exploited me so ruthlessly or displayed such selfish arrogance. Mark seemed to misunderstand, assuming my reluctance for divorce meant lingering love. To clarify my feelings, I declared, "I'll leave then." Mark, clearly unprepared for my agreement to a divorce and my willingness to leave, was stunned. He had to brace himself for the challenging times ahead. The past version of me, always bailing him out, was no more. From now on, no matter what happened to Mark, I wouldn't offer my help, for we wouldn't be a couple anymore. Mark stared at me in shock, frozen in place, providing me with the perfect opportunity to head to my room and pack the essentials. Larger items would have to be left behind. Today, it seemed evident that I needed to hire movers soon. As I prepared to leave, Mark approached me hastily, questioning my decision. "Are you sure about this? If we divorce, we'll be strangers," he said. I responded with a serene smile. "I've already fallen out of love with you. Letting go of what's not needed feels liberating." My words hung in the air, leaving Mark looking utterly lost. I nodded, thanking him for everything, and walked away from our house. Back at my parents' place, I explained the situation to them. Their initial fury at Mark's behavior subsided when they realized I had a plan. With their support, I started my recovery process. The first step was the divorce. After sending the papers, Mark messaged me, expressing uncertainty about the situation. I clarified my feelings, and he went silent. A few days later, I received the completed divorce papers from him, promptly filled out my parts, and submitted them to the county office. Now, Mark and I were complete strangers. I no longer had the responsibility of supporting the household as his wife. During the divorce, we divided our assets. Mark claimed the house, a burden to me from the start, so I gladly gave it up. Instead, I opted for alimony since Mark wasn't working. His parents covered it, but he seemed to be actively job hunting, probably planning to repay them once he found stable employment. However, reality had a way of challenging even the best laid plans. A month passed since the divorce was finalized, and I moved into a new home, enjoying a peaceful life. Then, I received a call from Mark. Annoyance bubbled within me, but ignoring him might create more problems. So, for the sake of my own future, I decided it was time to address the situation. "Hello, what do you want after all this time?" I answered the phone, my patience worn thin from dealing with Mark. His desperate plea for help barely registered as I urged him to get to the point. "Please, help me," he implored. His tone, though desperate, only elicited a cynical laugh from me. I anticipated Mark being in a tough situation, but the severity of his predicament surprised me. "Well, what happened?" "Oh, you have to tell me or I won't know, lol." Though I had a hunch about Mark's troubles, I wanted him to confess the details himself. Reluctantly, he began to explain, stumbling over his words. He had taken over the house I used to live in, managing fine for a month. However, he recently struggled to pay the rent since he was still unemployed. Thinking my former parents-in-law, who lived on a pension, could cover the expense, he asked them for help. But the bill turned out to be much higher than they expected. Around $1,800. My retired in-laws, living frugally, couldn't afford such an amount. Furious and blaming Mark, they confronted him. Lost and unsure, Mark reached out to me, tears in his voice, asking for assistance. Despite the frustration bubbling within me, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction seeing him face the consequences of his actions. He blamed me, venting his frustration about my lack of warning regarding the rent. I acknowledged my mistake, but reminded him that his ignorance about the monthly cost was entirely his own doing. He had treated me like an outsider and pushed me away, and now he was reaping the consequences. Sighing at his audacity, I listened as he continued, his plea for help persisting, seemingly oblivious to my feelings. "I need your help. We can't go on like this." Mark's voice carried a sense of urgency, highlighting their desperate situation. It was evident they felt cornered. I surmised that the rent due date had likely passed, and they might already be behind, considering the infamously short temper of the house owner. I remembered the stern warnings about never being late with rent payments while I lived there. Missing a payment could result in dire consequences, as Mark, having met the landlord, was well aware of. His plea for assistance was desperate, asking me to cover the rent for just 1 month. "I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right?" Mark's words were laced with selfishness, expecting me to help just because we were once married. I wanted to tell him that my feelings for him had long faded, but I held my tongue. Instead, I coldly replied, "I'm sorry, but do I have any obligation to help you? You were the one who left me. Isn't it too convenient for you to seek my help now?" Mark attempted to defend himself, pleading for understanding. "Please don't be so cold. I really can't do this without you. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter now. We used to be married. Can't you help me out just this once?" "No," I stated firmly, my patience wearing thin. "It's been a long time since I stopped loving you. You left me, and even before that, my feelings for you had already cooled." My response carried the weight of frustration and despair that had built up inside me over time. When I uttered those words, I could hear Mark's dejected voice on the other end of the phone. It hit me like a tidal wave of disbelief. For so long, I endured everything: his selfishness, his taking me for granted, his mistreatment, and even stood by him when I was unwell, all in an attempt to salvage our marriage. I had invested my efforts into making our life together work. But this was the outcome. The question that haunted me was why I hadn't left sooner. Why I hadn't distanced myself from Mark when my love for him had faded. Regret flooded in, mingling with the anger I felt towards him. Throughout our time together, Mark never truly faced me. He never showed concern, never tried to protect me, and never considered walking through life hand in hand as a couple. Every time he treated me like a mere maid or a money-making machine, he remained oblivious to my despair. Yet despite all this being a result of Mark's actions, he had the audacity to plead for my help as if he were the victim. His attitude felt so self-centered that it was nauseating. "Please help me, I'm begging you. How about we get married again? This time, we'll start over properly. I promise I'll never kick you out again," he said in desperation. I couldn't help but chuckle bitterly at his desperate proposal. "Remarried to you? Are you kidding me? All of this is the result of your own actions. I've tried to work with you in my own way for a long, long time. I kept trying to make you face me. Now you're telling me to start all over again with you, pretending that none of that ever happened. Do you want me to go back to those hellish days? That would never happen. I'm not going back to that life. No matter what," I exclaimed, my emotions boiling over. Tears began to flow, a mix of anger and sadness. Mark remained silent in response to my words. Unable to bear any more of this conversation, I simply said goodbye and hung up. After that, Mark didn't call, and wanting never to hear his voice again, I blocked his number. Later, I heard from mutual friends that Mark and his family got evicted from their home. In his own way, Mark tried to talk to my former in-laws and get them to pay the rent on his behalf. However, they were furious, stating, "That's not what we talked about," and refused. Consequently, they angered the landlord and had no choice but to leave. Mark hadn't had much luck finding a full-time job, so he was working part-time to make ends meet. Apparently, because they have been living together, my former in-laws had to sell their house and were now cramped in a run-down apartment. All three of them. As for me, I became engrossed in my work. My boss even discussed a promotion with me, It seemed I might be the first female manager in our company, and I received admiration from both colleagues and juniors. Sometimes friends asked, "Are you going to get married?" To be honest, after being forced into that kind of life, I had a negative view of marriage. The idea of dating a man or getting married again didn't appeal to me. But life was long, and there was no need to rush. In this generation, many people go their entire lives without getting married. If I could live my life without regrets, that's all that mattered. If I could live true to myself, that was enough. With that in mind, I wanted to continue walking through life at my own pace.